Just how deep are the upgrade opportunities for the Dolphins at each of their notable areas of need on this roster? That's our focus here today on this episode of Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. You're on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And a tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network, today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets. Guaranteed. It's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started with America's #1 sports book. Today on the show, we are looking at the depth of this draft through a very specific lens. And I will readily acknowledge that I have even more players to watch. So this will not be the full focus and breadth of this class. But power running back or running back 3, wide receiver 3, the tight end position, looking across the board, how many opportunities, how many players are there that would be considered upgrades over what the Dolphins have in that spot? And the idea is to measure how you grade the Dolphins players against how you project the rookies coming in to get a feel for how dire or how limited your options are to upgrade a spot. So if you are going to have some semblance of need in the back of your mind with your picks, you want to have an understanding the opportunity cost. If I pick a wide receiver at 21, I may come back at 55 and still have 6 guys that I feel like are upgrades over who our current wide receiver 3 is, unless the team were to sign, say, Odell Beckham between now and the draft, which probably isn't going to happen. That opportunity cost can come into play for coming up with the best combinations of picks, unless you're going to just strictly say, I'm drafting exclusively best player available, no questions asked. So you'd love as much as possible to have an intersection between need and value and have that and come out with this really likable combination with your early picks. And part of understanding how that is accomplished is understanding this is how deep it is. This is maybe a spot that you could wait until day 3 because of how deep the wide receiver group is or how deep one of the other groups is, as just using that position as an example, because it is an obscene amount of wealth of talent that's available in this year's class. So we're going to take the Dolphins player at a spot, and then we're going to stack up where I've watched now, and I've watched through the consensus about 115, 120 top consensus players in the class. So there may be some other spots where there's a player that I watch who's projected as an early day 3 guy that I actually like more for Miami specifically, and they could end up as a day 2 option as well. Some of these spots on the roster, it might not be until day 3 in which you'd be considering that spot based on the value of the prospect, and it'd still be an upgrade for Miami. But at least you can start to paint the picture a little bit. So let's start with running back, where you consider Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane as the top 2 backs. If you were looking for a third back in front of Jeff Wilson, this is what I would say. None of the players that I have graded in this class, regardless of where they are projected to be picked, check in front of Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane in the Dolphins offensive system. And that's a testament mainly to Devon Achane and what he did this season, assimilating within Miami's scheme, because he was not my top-ranked running back when he came out last year. But this is also a down running back class compared to that. But if you were looking for a player to step in front of Jeff Wilson and Chris Brooks, I would point to names like Trey Benson from Florida State, Blake Corum from Michigan, Jonathan Brooks from Texas, Braylon Allen from Wisconsin. That is the order in which I have those players graded specifically for Miami's scheme that bring a little bit more of a physicality to how they run. Corum's not a big guy, but he's 5'7". Right? So he's 5'7", 205. That runs a little different than if you were 6 foot, 205. I also have Bucky Irving graded in front of Jeff Wilson, but that's a little bit of a stylistic different kind of player. So you have a handful of talents. I would say Benson, Corum, Brooks probably come off the board on day one. Braylon Allen's probably the one who sneaks into early day three. So you don't really have a great intersection for where the Dolphins have picks, where there are players that I feel would tangibly be upgrades over that player. The complete and total inverse is opposite is true at wide receiver, where I don't have any wide receivers, including Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze, who in year one, that's an important thought too. This is not the ceiling of the player. It's where they're at right now. Would be an upgrade over Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Those are standalone players. But then you get to wide receiver 3, and well, right now it's either Braxton Berrios or Eric Ezukama, perhaps Odell Beckham. And if the Dolphins do sign Odell Beckham, this list will get significantly shorter. But because of the steep drop-off between Hill and Waddle and the current wide receiver 3 on the roster, I might have a dozen names. We have Harrison Jr., Neighbors, Odunze. Obviously, there's not feasible players for Miami with where they're drafting, but nevertheless, they'd still be upgrades over wide receiver 3. Pretty Ricky Pearsall out of Florida is a player that I like a ton. I have him kind of as the top of the next tier of players that would also include Ladd McConkey and Roman Wilson, Xavier Worthy, Xavier Levitt, A.D. Mitchell's in that tier as well. So that's kind of the tier 2 of wide receivers, all of which I think are upgrades over your current wide receiver 3. And then you have another tier down. I'm a little bit lower on Brian Thomas than the consensus, but he'd also be a wide receiver. He'd also be the wide receiver 3. Jalen McMillan from Washington, Keon Coleman from Florida State, Malachi Corley, Jalen Polk, Troy Franklin. Like, it's this total embarrassment of riches at wide receiver. And I think that's the biggest argument against drafting a wide receiver at 21. And the one who kind of consensus would be in conversation there would be Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU, who I'm already a little lower on than the consensus just because he doesn't run a really diverse route tree right away for what he's going to be to contribute in year one for the Dolphins. I mean, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 15 names that would be an upgrade. You have that in the back of your mind when you approach the wide receiver position. Our last skill group that we'll talk about here in the first lump is tight end position. And I actually have 3 players in this draft class that I think would be an upgrade over the best available tight end, highest graded tight end on the Dolphins roster. And Durham Smythe and Jonnu Smith are really tough because they are inverse players of one another. One is super athletic and dynamic with the ball in his hands, not necessarily an inline blocker, not known for his blocking ability, where the other one is has become and developed into a very stable blocker who can play with his hand in the dirt, but just has no ceiling whatsoever in the passing game. So like they're foils of one another already, and that kind of hurts both of their valuation to check in at. But I still have 3 players that I think would be an upgrade over both. Brock Bowers is one, and he got his time in the sun on Monday. We did the Brock Bowers episode talking about him and his fit in Miami's offense, how interested Miami should be, all of that. We did that in depth. But then there's 2 day 2 guys that I think would be the best tight end on the roster, which is saying something because tight ends typically come into the league and they struggle with transition. And that might be true for both of these guys, but I generally perceive both of them to be higher, not only higher ceiling, but higher floor players than either of the 2 foils of skill sets that Miami currently has in the tight end room. That's Ben Sinnott from Kansas State and Theo Johnson from Penn State. Theo Johnson, former CFL wide receiver, or not CFL. He's a Canadian high schooler. He's recruited Penn State. Was a wide receiver in high school in Canada. And then he comes to Penn State, converts to tight end, and is one of the most athletic profiles at the position in combine history as a 260-pound tight end. And then Sinnott is this. The drop-off from Brock Bowers to Ben Sinnott for me personally within Miami's offense is not the most stark and dramatic drop off of any offensive position. There are other positions where I think the best player available has a much more significant drop off from player one to player two. I think Sennett's a really, really good player. The passing game ceiling, they use him in the screen game as well. They manufacture touches for him. He's a bit of a seam stretcher, inline player, really exciting kind of multifaceted skill set that gives him, I think, a higher floor than anybody the Dolphins have on the roster. So that's the skill players. You have a surplus at wide receiver 3. You have a handful of players who I think could be your tight end 1 from the jump. And then you have a handful of players that would be your running back 3 from the jump. So wide receiver is the one where there is the obvious surplus. Now, offensive line, defensive line are next, and that conversation gets very interesting. And that's what we're going to talk about next here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. It's playoff time for the NBA and the NHL. Baseball is in full swing, unfortunately for Marlins fans. And FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That is $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic win with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. One of the things that I'm looking forward to is when I'm done doing player assessments for the 2024 NFL draft over on Touchdown Miami, which is the Substack that I run for long form written Dolphins analysis. It launched in February. It's Touchdown Miami on Substack. I'm going to put this board up, and I did the same thing in free agency for those of you who have subscribed to Touchdown Miami. But it affords you the opportunity to see the actual board. And each column is a position: quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, all the way across the board. And then each row is how high the player is graded. And I put the Dolphins players on the board alongside the free agents when we did pro scouting, and in the draft scape, all the prospects, so that you can very clearly see, okay, I want to identify, we're on offensive tackle. The highest graded Dolphins players, Teron Armstead. I have 2 offensive tackles that I have graded higher as Teron Armstead for what they are right now as players, which tells you have 2 players, in theory, that would be drafted by Miami and be the best offensive tackle on the roster. Joe Alt from Notre Dame is one. Troy Fautanu is the other. When we went through the list yesterday, the monster list, don't trade away from these players, or guarantee if you have an option to get one of several of them, you could trade down, but don't trade out of getting one of these players. The short list of must-haves, be ecstatic for drafting. Alt and Fautanu were on that list because I think, Teron Armstead, for all of the polish that he has, for all the instinct and the physical gifts he still has as a player that is getting toward the late stage of his career, the athleticism of Alt and Fautanu, with how they would mesh and marry with what Miami does, I think affords them a higher floor and a higher ceiling. So I have 2 tackles that I think would be the top offensive tackle for Miami. Now, obviously, Miami has secured a number of offensive tackle contracts between adjusting Teron Armstead and extending Austin Jackson and getting Keon Smith, or having Keon Smith as a developmental player, and then bringing back Kendall Lamb on a 1-year deal. Those are the only 2 players that I feel like would be an upgrade over either of the starters in year 1. There's players that, Olufashanu from Penn State, Amarius Mims from Georgia, Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma. I think some of those players have higher ceilings than Austin Jackson as an offensive tackle. And as Teron Armstead gets older and eventually comes off the board for Miami, the next tackle that moves up, there'll be a vacancy there in which there would be other names that are invoked. But for 2024 specifically, I have 2 tackles that I think would be the top offensive tackle on the roster, but no other tackles that would be better than Austin Jackson for year 1. I think Olufashanu, his development has been kind of inconsistent at Penn State. and there's some leaning in him. There's some eagerness to get out and get hands-on at the expense of his center of gravity and his base and his framing at times. And that's all stuff Austin Jackson battled with earlier in his career before finally turning the corner. It's a very different conversation at guard, though, or interior offensive line, because it put the centers and the guards together. Isaiah Wynn and Aaron Brewer are the two top-rated offensive players. The top-rated interior player that I think would be an upgrade over potentially both of those is Graham Barton. I have him graded as an interior offensive lineman. Played at Duke, can play all 5 spots on the offensive line. I do think he's an upgrade over everybody that Dolphins have on the roster. I think he has a chance to be the best interior offensive lineman on the roster year one. Talise Fuaga is also in that conversation. I have him graded as an interior offensive lineman specifically for Miami because he graded higher as an interior player based on the criteria of playing inside versus the criteria of playing a tackle. But this is where it gets really interesting. Is potentially talking about drafting a player like that at 21 for either of those two players if they make it to you. But then you also have Jackson Powers-Johnson, who maybe not an upgrade over Aaron Brewer specifically at guard when tailored for the system, or Isaiah Wynn. And you acknowledge that durability is a question for Isaiah Wynn. But the third spot right now is Liam Eichenberg's the next highest graded interior offensive lineman for me on the Dolphins board. And here's some of the names, like Zach Frazier from West Virginia, Jackson Powers-Johnson from Oregon, Christian Haynes from Connecticut, Cooper Beebe from Kansas State, Zach Zinter from Michigan, who's coming off of an injury. And there's other names that I have not done yet. I've not finished the evaluation on Christian Mahogany from Boston College, or Dominic Pooney from Kansas, or Brandon Coleman from TCU. So it's already a deep group. It's not deep like wide receiver, but the upgrade opportunities run deep on the interior offensive line. And you're talking about guys that are like potentially 3rd, 4th round picks, not just guys that are, you could get them at 21, or you might be able to come back and get one of them at 55 if you're lucky. The depth there for a starting player versus even wide receiver 3, that's the deepest group on the offensive side of the ball, is the interior offensive line, to find a player who would be a starter and be your third interior offensive lineman behind Isaiah Wynn and Aaron Brewer. So that's the part for me when you're mocking offensive linemen. If you're going to take one early, you'd ideally get that offensive tackle ceiling to when Teron Armstead comes off the board. He's now an upgrade at offensive tackle long-term, as well as just being a short-term upgrade over your third interior offensive lineman, or potentially all of your interior offensive line. So I'm hoping this is painting more of a 3-dimensional picture of where I think the talent falls. You go over to the defensive side of the ball. The same thing can be said, where I have Byron Murphy from Texas as my top-graded interior offensive line, or interior defensive line. And I have him graded about the same as what I have Zach Sealer graded. I think he can be that good right away, because he's good on the early downs against the run, and he's explosive to win in the passing game. Johnny Newton, not quite as refined against the run, more refined as a pass rusher. He's in the same tier as Murphy and Sealer, but he would be third on that pecking order out of those players. But then your next highest graded interior defensive lineman, whether it's T.R. Tart or Jonathan Harris or Neville Gallimore, I have all those guys very closely bunched together as kind of the next guys in line. I got Michael Hall from Ohio State. It's a day 2 guy. Brandon Dorlus from Oregon. It's a day 2 guy. Rook Orhorho from Clemson. I'm working on making sure I get the name exactly right. That's a day 2 guy. Devondre Sweat from Texas. Nose tackle, so a little bit of a different style, but a day 2 guy, and it had some off-the-field issues this past weekend that may cause him to slide even further. Chris Jenkins from Michigan, another guy who would be the second best interior defensive lineman on the roster, in spite of the infusion of rotational guys that Miami has brought in. And then I haven't watched Christian Boyd from Northern Iowa yet, or Dwayne Carter from Duke. So this group runs deep as well. And Braden Fisk, I already did a deep dive on Braden Fisk. I know a lot of people are really excited about the athletic profile there. I talked about him in depth on an earlier show. I have some questions. You can go back and listen to it. But the point being, the same conversation that can be had about, well, this is technically a starting player, but you're not just getting upgrade opportunities at 21. You're getting upgrade opportunities at 55. You could potentially get an upgrade opportunity if you pick a little later. That's kind of the next stage. And we already established when you pick at 21, these are the guys I wouldn't trade away from. But if you don't get any of those players and you do have an opportunity to trade away, understanding the three dimensions of how all of the layers of each position group and the upgrade opportunities that exist there overlap with one another is important context to help understand how to maximize this opportunity with this draft. I'm going to quickly acknowledge some edge rushers. I don't have any edge rushers that would grade above Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips. I do have Jared Verse and Leatu Latu in the same tier as Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb. So that's kind of the ceiling players there. But then you get past Shaq Barrett, and I think the field whittles a little bit. I think the top of the edge group's really exciting between Verse, Latu, Dallas Turner. You can include the Robinsons in there. Chop Robinson from Penn State and Darius Robinson is kind of fringe first-round guys. But then beyond that, guys who I think could be definitively your fourth edge rusher. It's kind of wide open because we don't really know what Miami has there after Shaq Barrett. But I would include names like Muhammad Kamara from Colorado State. I'm really excited about him as a 6'1", 250-pound guy with some length and some explosiveness and power, speed to power ability. Austin Booker from Kansas reminds me a little bit of Alex Highsmith coming out from Charlotte, but there was a developmental curve there, and Booker's only 240 pounds. So is that too light? Jonah Ellis is another explosive but undersized guy from Utah. Reminds me of the ceiling there is maybe a little Andrew Van Ginkel I could see. Braylon Trice, I have some questions about where he cut a bunch of weight to come in and run 4.7. A little worried about his explosiveness. I kind of get some Curtis Weavery vibes there, but he was really productive at Washington. Gabriel Murphy from UCLA, kind of one of the other quote-unquote edge rush guys at UCLA. Adisa Isaac from Penn State is the quote-unquote other Penn State edge rusher. Chris Braswell, the quote-unquote other Alabama pass rusher. Like there's a lot. So I think that's a really fascinating group for Miami because a lot of those guys are generally considered to be day 3 guys. And you need a fourth edge rusher and a guy with some upside from an athletic profile perspective. Some of those guys are going to run deep. We'll talk back 7 here to bring this episode of Locked On Dolphins to a close. So stick with us. Linebackers, safeties, and corners for Miami is an interesting group. I have no linebackers graded. Actually, that's a lie. Peyton Wilson from NC State. But there's medical stuff here that I think just makes it too risk-averse for Miami to sign themselves up for. I have Peyton Wilson just on tape graded better than both David Long and Jordan Brooks as a player. I think he's an outstanding linebacker. But multiple shoulder injuries that were season-ending, multiple knee injuries that were season-ending. It's just too much for early draft pick for Miami. Now, if you end up falling into a bunch of mid-round draft capital and he's sitting there for you after you make 2, 3, 4 picks, yeah, go ahead. But I just think there's too much of a distance between that scenario and the reality that Miami's living in right now for me to say, yeah, Peyton Wilson, there's going to be an intersection where it makes sense for Miami to pick. I have no other players that would be an upgrade over the 2 starters that Miami has at linebacker with Long and Jordan Brooks, which makes that a pretty short conversation. And then you consider they already brought in a vet in Anthony Walker. They have a special teams guy in Duke Riley. You feel set at linebacker. At corner, though, there is a player, and we acknowledged him. He was on the list yesterday, Quinyon Mitchell from Toledo. I think he'd be an upgrade over Kendall Fuller right off the jump. He's not an upgrade over Jalen Ramsey. Not a lot of players in the NFL who would be, regardless of how experienced you are in the league. But Mitchell, I do think, would be the second best corner on the team. Now, if you get between Kendall Fuller and, say, Kader Kohou, kind of where I had Cam Smith graded last year, and I'm going off the rookie eval that I had for Cam Smith last year, there's a block of guys who would be kind of the nickel, the third player. But I think when you put it through the context that Cam Smith exists, and Cam Smith was your top pick last year, and they seem excited about Cam Smith, even though he didn't play last year for some circumstances with that scheme. I don't think it's a realistic. I think the only way you'd pick a corner is if you had best player available, Quinyon Mitchell, in your lap at 21, which I don't think is going to happen because I think he's far and away the best corner in the class. But I would at least acknowledge that Terrion Arnold, who's a little bit more zone focused, Kool-Aid McKinstry, who's a little bit more man focused, Nate Wiggins, who has elite short area change of ability, but is an undersized player, and then another undersized player who's exclusively a nickel player, and Mike Sandersill from Michigan. Would, on my board and my rankings, be the third best corner for Miami. But when you consider Cam Smith and where they graded him at, Cam Smith for me is the third best corner. Kader Coe, who we saw the ceiling as a rookie, we saw the floor in year 2. Where does he fall on that spectrum? There's a little bit of a question there, but because of the youth that they have there, including a draft pick from last year who graded fairly well, just didn't get a chance to see the field. If you're not talking, this would be the second best corner on the team in Quinyon Mitchell, I don't think it would make any sense whatsoever to go that direction. Although they love drafting corners, so you never know. At safety, this is probably the least complete position group that I have done thus far. I have done Tyler Nubin from Minnesota. I've done Jaden Hicks from Washington State. I did both the Utah safeties, Cole Bishop and Sion Vaki. I did Cooper DeJean. I graded him as a safety, graded higher as a safety than I did as a corner. And I did both the Miami Hurricanes guys, Cam Kinchins and James Williams. The only safety who graded higher than Jordan Poyer's, the second safety on the Dolphins roster, would be Cooper DeJean. I have some big-time questions about this safety class. Some of these guys have really concerning athletic profiles. The two that don't are Jaden Hicks from Washington State and Cole Bishop. They'd be the third safety for me right now. If they were to come in, they both have good athletic profiles, but tackling and specifically in space was an issue for both guys. So if you're looking at where are the deepest opportunities to find an upgrade over a hole on the roster, it's defensive tackle, it's interior offensive line, and it's wide receiver, which I think most people would point to as your three most pressing needs. It's not a bad spot to be. You also have depth, but you also have like late round depth to address like your third/fourth edge as well. That's going to do it for us here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, painting a three-dimensional plane of how deep the upgrade opportunities are for this specific role on the Dolphins roster. Make sure you keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. We have some guests coming a little later this week. Looking forward to bringing those to you. And I will be back again with another episode of Locked On Dolphins before you know it. Fins up.